September 13th, 1943. The hills of southern Italy burned under a merciless sun. The air shimmered with heat and the acrid smell of cordite. Dust clung to everything: uniforms, weapons, skin. In the small village of Altavilla, perched on a rocky slope overlooking the Sile River Valley, the American Fifth Army was supposed to be advancing. Instead, they were dying. Sergeant Charles E. Kelly crouched behind a stone wall that had stood for 300 years and would probably outlast him by another 300. His Thompson submachine gun was hot to the touch. His canteen was empty. And somewhere down the hill, a full German battalion was preparing to overrun his position. Behind him, wounded men groaned in the shade of a bombed-out farmhouse. Medics worked frantically, their hands slick with blood. The radio operator kept calling for artillery support, but the response was always the same: negative. All batteries engaged elsewhere. Hold your position. Kelly looked at the horizon. He could see the German tanks forming up, infantry moving in columns, mortars being positioned. They weren't hiding. They didn't need to. They had the numbers, the firepower, the momentum. And then Kelly saw it, just 200 yards to his left, abandoned by a retreating artillery unit hours earlier, a 60mm mortar, sitting there like a gift from God or a test from the devil. He wasn't trained on mortars. He had no authorization to use it. And technically, borrowing military equipment without permission was a court-martial offense. But Charles Kelly had never been much for technicalities. He stood up, dusted off his pants, and said to no one in particular, "Well, somebody's got to do something." And with that, the man they would later call Commando Kelly walked straight into legend. Who was Charles E. Kelly? Charles Edward Kelly was born on September 23, 1920, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Not the nice part of Pittsburgh, the part where steel mills belched smoke 24 hours a day, and the air tasted like iron and sweat. His father, Edward, worked at the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. His mother, Mary, took in laundry to make ends meet. Charles was the second of 5 children, all crammed into a 2-bedroom row house that shook every time a train passed. He grew up fast. By age 12, he was working odd jobs, delivering newspapers, shining shoes, hauling scrap metal. By 14, he'd dropped out of school to work full-time at a machine shop. Not because he wanted to, but because his family needed the money. Charles wasn't big, 5'8", maybe 150 pounds soaking wet, but he was wiry, quick, and stubborn as a mule. His friends called him Scrappy. His teachers, back when he still went to school, called him a troublemaker. His mother called him her little fighter. He had a temper. Not the explosive kind, but the slow-burning kind that made him dangerous when pushed. Once, a foreman at the steel mill tried to short his father's pay. Charles, barely 16, walked into the man's office and didn't leave until the money was paid in full. He didn't threaten, he didn't yell, he just stood there, arms crossed, staring, until the foreman caved. That was Charles Kelly. Quiet until he wasn't. Calm until action was required. And when action was required, he didn't hesitate. The neighborhood where Charles grew up was tough. Not movie tough, but real tough. The kind of place where you learned to fight, or you learned to run. And running only worked for so long. Charles learned to fight. Not with his fists, though he could handle himself in a scrap, but with his mind. He learned to read people, to anticipate trouble, to know when to stand his ground and when to walk away. He learned that respect wasn't given. It was earned. That loyalty mattered more than money. That your word was your bond, and if you broke it, you were nothing. These weren't lessons from books. They were lessons from the street, from watching his father come home exhausted every night but still find time to help a neighbor fix a broken stove, from watching his mother stretch $1 until it screamed, but still manage to feed a hungry kid from down the block. Charles Kelly learned what it meant to be a man in a place where being a man meant taking care of your own, standing up for what was right, and never, ever backing down when it mattered. When the war broke out in 1941, Charles was 21 years old, working at a munitions factory in Pittsburgh. He could have stayed. Munitions workers were exempt from the draft, essential to the war effort. But Charles didn't want to be essential from a distance. He wanted to be useful up close. So on December 15th, 1941, just 8 days after Pearl Harbor, he walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the United States Army. The recruiter looked at his slight frame and asked, "You sure about this, son?" Charles looked him dead in the eye and said, "I didn't come here to talk about it." He was assigned to the 36th Infantry Division, a Texas National Guard unit that had been federalized and was training for deployment. Charles, a Yankee from Pittsburgh, was suddenly surrounded by drawling Texans who called him Yank and made fun of his accent. He didn't care. He kept his head down, did his job, and learned everything he could: how to strip a rifle blindfolded, how to read a map in the dark, how to move through terrain without making a sound. But what he learned most was improvisation. Because in the chaos of training, when equipment broke or orders didn't make sense or plans fell apart, Charles Kelly had a gift. He could look at a problem, see 3 solutions no one else thought of, and pick the one that worked. His sergeant once said, "Kelly doesn't follow the manual. He rewrites it as he goes." It wasn't a compliment. Not yet. But it would be. The training was brutal. Long marches in the Texas heat. Live fire exercises where mistakes could kill you. Night maneuvers where you learned to trust your instincts more than your eyes. Charles excelled. Not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he was smart. He paid attention. He learned from other people's mistakes, and he never made the same mistake twice. He also learned something else: that in combat, the difference between life and death often came down to seconds, to split-second decisions made under pressure, and that the men who survived weren't always the ones who followed the plan. They were the ones who adapted when the plan fell apart. By the summer of 1943, the 36th Infantry Division was in North Africa, preparing for the invasion of Italy. Charles Kelly, now a corporal, had seen his first combat in Tunisia. He'd been under fire, seen men die, learned the difference between training and war. And he'd learned something else: that when the bullets started flying and the plans fell apart, the men who survived weren't always the ones who followed orders. They were the ones who adapted. Charles Kelly was very good at adapting. The road to Italy. The North African campaign had been a brutal education. Charles Kelly arrived in Tunisia in early 1943, part of the Allied push to drive the Germans out of Africa. The 36th Division wasn't at the tip of the spear, but they saw action. Enough action to separate the soldiers from the boys. Kelly's first firefight came on a dusty road outside Bizerte. His squad was on patrol when they ran into a German reconnaissance unit. The shooting started before anyone had time to think. Kelly dove behind a rock, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. But then something clicked. The training took over. He stopped thinking and started acting. He returned fire, called out targets, helped coordinate his squad's response. When it was over, 3 Germans were dead, 2 were captured, and Kelly's squad had suffered only one minor wound. His sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Tom Harkins, clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work, Kelly. You kept your head." Kelly nodded, but inside he was shaking, not from fear, but from the realization of what he'd just done. He'd killed men, human beings with families, with lives, with hopes and dreams, and he'd done it without hesitation. That night, he sat alone, staring at his hands. Harkins found him there. "First time's always the hardest," the sergeant said. "You did what you had to do. They would have killed you if you hadn't killed them first." Kelly looked up. "Does it get easier?" Harkins was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "It doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it." Over the next few months, Kelly got better at carrying it. He fought in half a dozen engagements. He learned to read terrain, to anticipate enemy movements, to trust his instincts. He was promoted to sergeant, put in charge of his own squad. And he learned something else. That leadership wasn't about barking orders. It was about earning trust, about showing your men that you wouldn't ask them to do anything you wouldn't do, yourself, about making decisions quickly and living with the consequences. By the time the North African campaign ended in May 1943, Charles Kelly was a different man than the one who'd enlisted 18 months earlier. He was harder, colder, more focused, but he was also more confident, more capable, more ready for what was coming next. And what was coming next was Italy. The invasion of Italy. On September 9, 1943, the Allied forces launched Operation Avalanche, the amphibious invasion of mainland Italy at Salerno. The goal was simple: establish a beachhead, push inland, and drive north toward Naples and Rome. The execution was anything but simple. The Germans, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had anticipated the landing. They had fortified the hills overlooking the beaches. They had positioned artillery, dug in machine gun nests, and prepared a defense in depth that would turn the Salerno beachhead into a killing ground. The 36th Infantry Division landed on the southern end of the beachhead, near Paestum. The beaches were chaos. Landing craft hit sandbars and got stuck. Men waded ashore under machine gun fire. Mortars rained down. The sand turned red. Charles Kelly, now a sergeant, led his squad off the landing craft and into hell. He didn't think, he just moved, shouting orders, pulling men to cover, returning fire. They made it off the beach. Barely. And then began the slow, brutal push inland. For the next 4 days, the 36th Division fought for every yard. The terrain was unforgiving. Rocky hills, narrow valleys, olive groves that provided cover for German snipers. The heat was oppressive. Water was scarce. Casualties mounted. Kelly's squad lost 2 men on the first day. A kid from Houston named Billy Martinez took a sniper round through the throat. He died before the medic could reach him. Another man, a farm boy from Oklahoma named Dale Henderson, stepped on a mine. They found pieces of him scattered across 20 yards. Kelly kept his squad moving. He had to. If they stopped, if they froze, they'd all die. So he pushed them forward, 1 yard at a time, one firefight at a time. At night, when they dug in and tried to sleep, Kelly would sit with his back against a tree, his Thompson across his lap, and think about the men he'd lost. He'd write letters to their families, trying to find words that would somehow make sense of senseless deaths. He never found the right words. But he wrote the letters anyway, because it was the least he could do. By September 13th, the division had pushed several miles inland and was approaching the town of Altavilla, a small hilltop village that overlooked the Selle River Valley. Altavilla was strategically vital. Whoever controlled it controlled the high ground, and whoever controlled the high ground controlled the battlefield. The Americans took Altavilla on the morning of September 13th. It was a hard fight, but they took it. And for a few hours, it seemed like they might hold it. Then the Germans counterattacked. Not with a platoon, not with a company, with a full battalion, over 500 men, supported by tanks, artillery, and air support. The Americans, exhausted and low on ammunition, were caught off guard. Units began to fall back, some in good order, some in panic. Charles Kelly's company was ordered to hold a position on the southern edge of the village, a stone farmhouse, a low wall, and a few scattered olive trees. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Behind them, wounded men were being evacuated. Medics worked frantically. The radio operator kept calling for support, but the response was always the same. Negative. All units engaged. Hold your position. Kelly looked at his men. 12 of them. Tired, scared, running low on ammo. He looked at the valley below. German infantry advancing in waves, tanks moving up the road, mortars beginning to range in, and then he saw it. The mortar, sitting there, abandoned. The decision Kelly stared at the mortar for a long moment. His mind raced through the calculations, the distance, the exposure, the risk. One of his men, a corporal named Eddie Bronson, followed his gaze. "Sarge, you're not thinking what I think you're thinking." Kelly didn't answer. He was still calculating. 200 yards of open ground. German machine guns had clear lines of fire. Mortars were already ranging in. The odds of making it there and back were maybe 50-50. Maybe worse. But the odds of holding this position without that mortar were 0. Kelly looked at his men. They were good men. They'd followed him through hell. They trusted him. And if he didn't do something, they were all going to die here. He made his decision. "I'm going to get that mortar," he said. Bronson grabbed his arm. "Sarge, that's suicide." Kelly looked at him. "So is staying here without it." Another man, Jimmy Reeves, a kid from Dallas who couldn't have been more than 19, spoke up. "I'll go with you, Sarge." Kelly shook his head. "No, I need you here. If I don't make it back, you're in charge." Reeves started to protest, but Kelly cut him off. "That's an order, Jimmy." Kelly checked his Thompson, made sure he had a full magazine. He took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and climbed over the wall. The unauthorized artillery. The moment Kelly's boots hit the ground on the other side of the wall, the world exploded. German machine guns opened up. Bullets kicked up dirt all around him. He ran, zigzagging, keeping low, moving fast. A mortar round landed 30 feet to his left. The blast wave knocked him sideways, but he kept his feet. He dove behind a low rise, caught his breath, then kept moving. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because if he stopped, he was dead. He could hear his men behind him laying down covering fire. The crack of M1 Garands, the chatter of a bar. It wasn't much, but it was something. It kept the Germans' heads down, gave him a chance. He reached the mortar, grabbed it, and started dragging it back. The base plate alone weighed 45 pounds. The tube was another 12, plus the bipod. It was like dragging a dead body. Halfway back, a mortar round landed 20 feet away. The blast threw him forward. His ears rang, his vision blurred, he tasted blood. But he held on to the mortar. He could see the wall now. 50 yards, 40, 30, a machine gun found him. Bullets stitched the ground inches from his feet. He dove, rolled, came up running. 20 yards, 10. Hands reached over the wall, grabbed him, pulled him over. He collapsed behind the wall, gasping for air, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. Jimmy Reeves stared at him. "You're insane." Kelly grinned through the blood and dirt. "Yeah, but I got the mortar." Bronson was already checking him for wounds. "You're hit, Sarge." Kelly looked down. There was blood on his left arm, a long gash from shrapnel. He hadn't even felt it. "It's nothing. Get me some bandages and let's set up this mortar." They wrapped his arm quickly, then helped him set up the mortar behind the wall. Kelly positioned it, angling it toward the advancing Germans. He had no fire direction center, no forward observer, no range tables, just his eyes and his gut. He estimated the range, about 800 yards. He adjusted the elevation, dropped a round down the tube. The mortar coughed. The round arced through the air and landed short, way short, maybe 400 yards. Kelly adjusted. Tried again. This time it landed long, overshot by 200 yards. Third time. Closer. He was getting the feel of it now. Fourth round, direct hit, right in the middle of a German infantry formation. Bodies flew. The advance hesitated. Kelly smiled. "Now we're cooking." For the next hour, Charles Kelly operated that mortar like a man possessed. He fired round after round, adjusting on the fly, walking the shells into German positions with brutal precision. He hit infantry formations. He hit machine gun nests. He hit a tank that had stopped to reposition. He even hit a German mortar crew that was trying to range in on his position. His men fed him ammunition. They called out targets. They cheered with every hit. And the Germans, confused and battered, began to slow their advance. But Kelly wasn't done. Not even close. The counterattack intensifies by noon. The situation had stabilized. The German advance had stalled. But Kelly knew it wouldn't last. He could see them regrouping in the valley, bringing up more troops, more tanks, more artillery. The radio operator, a kid from New Jersey named Sal Martino, kept trying to raise headquarters. "Still nothing, Sarge. I think the radio's shot." Kelly nodded. They were on their own. No reinforcements, no artillery support, no air cover, just 12 men, a mortar, and whatever ammunition they had left. He did a quick inventory. They had maybe 30 mortar rounds left. Ammunition for the rifles was running low. The bar was down to its last 2 magazines, and the men were exhausted, running on adrenaline and fear. Kelly looked at the valley. The Germans were forming up for another push. This time they were bringing tanks. He could see 3 Panzer IVs moving up the road, infantry following behind. He turned to his men. "Listen up. They're coming again, and this time they're bringing armor. We can't stop tanks with what we've got. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to make them think we have more than we do." Bronson frowned. "How do we do that?" Kelly smiled. "We're going to be loud. We're going to move around. We're going to make them think there's a full company up here, not just a squad. We're going to bluff." He assigned positions. 2 men on the left flank, 2 on the right, the rest in the center. "Keep moving. Fire a few rounds, then move to a new position. Make them think we're everywhere." He turned to the mortar. "And I'm going to make them think we have a full artillery battery." For the next 2 hours, Kelly and his men put on a show. They fired from different positions. They shouted orders to imaginary units. They even set off a few grenades in empty buildings to simulate incoming artillery. And it worked. The German advance was cautious, hesitant. They were taking fire from multiple directions. They couldn't get a fix on the American positions. They thought they were facing a much larger force. But Kelly knew the bluff couldn't last forever. Eventually, The Germans would figure it out. Eventually, they'd commit to a full assault. And when that happened, 12 men and a mortar weren't going to be enough. He needed to do something more, something crazy, something that would buy his men enough time for reinforcements to arrive. He needed to take the fight to the Germans. The one-man army, Kelly, made his decision. He turned to Bronson. "You're in charge. Keep up the fire. Keep moving. Make them think we're still here in force." Bronson stared at him. "What are you going to do?" Kelly checked his Thompson, grabbed extra magazines, stuffed grenades into his pockets. "I'm going hunting." Jimmy Reeves grabbed his arm. "Sarge, you can't go out there alone. That's suicide." Kelly looked at him. "Maybe. But if I can get behind them, 'cause some chaos, they'll have to divert troops to deal with me. That takes pressure off you guys." Bronson shook his head. "This is insane." Kelly grinned. "Yeah, but it might work." He paused. "If I don't make it back, you know what to do. Hold this position as long as you can, then fall back to the secondary line." He didn't wait for a response. He climbed over the wall and disappeared into the olive groves. Kelly moved through the terrain like a ghost. He'd learned this in training, how to use cover, how to move silently, how to become invisible. But this was different. This was real. One mistake, and he was dead. He circled wide, using the terrain to stay hidden. The olive groves provided good cover, but they also limited visibility. He had to move carefully, stopping often to listen, to watch, to make sure he wasn't walking into an ambush. After 20 minutes, he reached the German lines. He could hear them talking, shouting orders, moving equipment. He crept closer, staying low, using every bit of cover. He found a German machine gun position. 3 men. They were focused on the farmhouse, on Kelly's men. They didn't see him until it was too late. Kelly opened fire. The Thompson roared. All 3 went down before they could react. He didn't stop. He grabbed the German machine gun, a MG-42, and as much ammunition as he could carry. Then he moved on. He found another position. 2 men with a mortar. He shot one, tackled the other. They struggled for a moment. Then Kelly's knife found the man's throat. He kept moving, found a German officer rallying troops. Kelly shot him. The troops scattered. For the next hour, Charles Kelly moved through the German lines like a one-man wrecking crew. He didn't charge blindly. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He moved with purpose, with precision, with a cold, calculated fury. He used captured German grenades. He used their own ammunition. At one point, he even used a German machine gun he'd taken from a dead soldier. The Germans didn't know what was happening. They thought they were being attacked by a full squad. Maybe a platoon. They started pulling back, consolidating, trying to figure out where the fire was coming from. It was coming from one man. One stubborn, fearless, slightly insane sergeant from Pittsburgh. The turning point, Kelly had been behind enemy lines for over an hour when he found it. A German command post, set up in a small stone building. He could see officers inside, studying maps, coordinating the attack. This was the nerve center. Take it out, and the German attack would fall apart. But it was heavily guarded. At least a dozen men outside, more inside. Kelly was one man with a Thompson and a few grenades. The odds were impossible. But Kelly had never been much for odds. He studied the position. The guards were focused outward, watching for threats from the American lines. They weren't expecting an attack from behind. Kelly circled around, using a dry creek bed for cover. He got within 30 yards of the building. close enough. He pulled out 2 grenades, pulled the pins, and threw them through the windows. Then he opened fire with the Thompson, spraying the entrance. The grenades exploded. The building erupted in flames and screams. German soldiers poured out, confused, disoriented. Kelly cut them down. More Germans came running. Kelly fell back, using the terrain, firing in short bursts. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he had surprise and momentum. He led them on a chase through the olive groves, picking them off one by one. When his Thompson ran dry, he grabbed a German rifle. When that ran out of ammunition, he used his pistol. By the time he made it back to his lines, the sun was setting. He was covered in dirt, blood, and sweat. His Thompson was empty. His uniform was torn. But he was alive. His men stared at him like he was a ghost. Jimmy Reeves finally spoke. "Sarge, what the hell did you just do?" Kelly collapsed behind the wall, gasping for air. "Borrowed some German equipment. Figured they wouldn't mind." Bronson handed him a canteen. "The Germans pulled back. They're regrouping, but they're not attacking. What did you do out there?" Kelly took a long drink. "Made them think we had more than we do. Caused some chaos. Took out their command post." Bronson stared at him. "You took out their command post? By yourself?" Kelly shrugged. "Seemed like a good idea at the time." That night the Germans didn't attack. They pulled back, regrouped, and decided that Altavilla wasn't worth the cost. The Americans held the village, and Charles Kelly, the sergeant who'd borrowed a mortar and then decided to take on a battalion by himself, became a legend. The aftermath, the next morning, Kelly's company commander, Captain Robert T. Simmons, called him into what was left of the farmhouse. Kelly expected a reprimand, maybe even a court-martial. After all, he'd taken military equipment without authorization. He'd left his position without orders. He'd acted completely outside the chain of command. Instead, Captain Simmons looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Kelly, you're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest." Kelly thought about it. "Can it be both, sir?" Simmons smiled. "Probably." He paused. "I'm recommending you for the Medal of Honor." Kelly blinked. "Sir, you held off a battalion, by yourself, with a mortar you weren't trained on, and a Thompson with 3 magazines. If that's not Medal of Honor material, I don't know what is." Kelly didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing that made sense. "I was just doing my job, sir." Simmons shook his head. "No, Kelly. You did everyone's job, and then some." The recommendation went up the chain. It was reviewed, investigated, corroborated by witnesses. Every man in Kelly's squad gave statements. Other units that had been in the area confirmed the German casualties, the destroyed command post, the chaos that had thrown the German attack into disarray. And on August 23, 1944, nearly a year after the battle at Altavilla, Sergeant Charles E. Kelly was awarded the Medal of Honor by Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers in a ceremony in Italy. The citation read, in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. On September 13, 1943, near Altavilla, Italy, Sergeant Kelly voluntarily joined a patrol which located and neutralized enemy machine gun positions. After this hazardous duty, he volunteered to establish contact with a battalion of American troops, which had been cut off. Proceeding alone 50 yards ahead of the patrol, he encountered an enemy machine gun nest. He opened fire, killed 2 Germans, and forced the remaining 3 to surrender. He then continued 300 yards ahead of his patrol and killed 2 snipers. Upon his return to his company, he secured a mortar and single-handedly broke up a German attack, killing approximately 40 of the enemy. When the Germans attacked again, he secured a machine gun and poured such deadly fire into the advancing enemy that they were forced to withdraw. The citation didn't mention that he'd borrowed the mortar without permission. It didn't mention that he'd acted completely outside orders. It didn't mention that by every technical definition, he'd violated military protocol. Because sometimes, the right thing to do isn't in the manual. Commando Kelly. After receiving the Medal of Honor, Charles Kelly became a celebrity. The press loved him. They called him Commando Kelly, a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. He was sent on a war bond tour across the United States. He gave speeches, shook hands, posed for photographs. He hated every minute of it. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't comfortable with attention. He was a soldier, and all he wanted was to get back to his unit. In one interview, a reporter asked him, "What does it feel like to be a hero?" Kelly looked at him and said, "I'm not a hero. The heroes are the guys who didn't make it home." The reporter pressed, "But you single-handedly held off a German battalion. You saved your entire company." Kelly shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. I had 12 good men with me. They held that position. They kept fighting. I just did what needed to be done." But the Army had other plans. They needed heroes. They needed symbols. And Charles Kelly, the scrappy kid from Pittsburgh who'd taken on a German battalion with borrowed equipment and sheer guts, was the perfect symbol. The war bond tour took him to 15 cities in 30 days. He spoke at factories, at schools, at rallies. He shook thousands of hands, signed hundreds of autographs, posed for countless photographs. And every night, alone in his hotel room, he thought about his men, the ones who'd made it, the ones who hadn't. Billy Martinez, Dale Henderson, all the others whose names he carried like stones in his heart. He was eventually allowed to return to combat. He fought in southern France. He fought in Germany. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a sniper's bullet. Both times he refused evacuation until the fighting was over. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Charles Kelly had been promoted to second lieutenant. He'd earned the Medal of Honor, 2 Silver Stars, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. But if you asked him what he was most proud of, he'd tell you it was the fact that most of his men made it home. Life after war, Charles Kelly returned to Pittsburgh in the summer of 1945. The city threw him a parade. The mayor gave him a key to the city. The newspapers ran front-page stories. Kelly smiled, waved, and then quietly went home. He married his sweetheart, a woman named Grace, whom he'd known since high school. They bought a small house in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. He got a job at a steel mill. Not because he needed the money, the Army had offered him a pension, but because he needed to work. He needed to feel useful. He didn't talk about the war much. When people asked, he'd give short answers. It was tough. We did what we had to do. I was lucky. But sometimes, late at night, Grace would find him sitting on the back porch, staring at nothing. She'd sit beside him, take his hand, and they'd sit in silence. He had nightmares. He had flashbacks. He had what we now call PTSD, though back then they just called it being shell-shocked or having bad nerves. But he didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. He just kept going. Because that's what Charles Kelly did. He kept going. He and Grace had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He taught them to work hard, to stand up for themselves, to do the right thing even when it was hard. He never told them about Altavilla. They learned about it from a teacher who'd read about it in a history book. When his oldest son asked him, "Dad, is it true you fought a whole German battalion by yourself?" Kelly thought for a moment, then said, "I had help. I always had help." His son pressed, "But the stories say you were alone." Kelly smiled. "I was never alone. I had my training. I had my instincts. I had the guys who taught me. I had the guys who were counting on me. That's not alone." Kelly worked at the steel mill for 25 years. He was a good worker, reliable, never complained. His co-workers knew he was a war hero, but he never talked about it. He was just Charlie, the guy who always had your back, who'd help you fix your car or lend you money when times were tough. He coached Little League Baseball. He volunteered at the VFW. He helped organize the annual Veterans Day Parade. He lived a quiet, ordinary life. But to the people who knew him, who really knew him, there was nothing ordinary about Charles Kelly. He was the kind of man who made the world better just by being in it. The legacy Charles E. Kelly died on January 11th, 1985, at the age of 64. He'd suffered a heart attack while working in his garage. He was fixing a neighbor's lawnmower. His funeral was attended by hundreds, veterans from World War II, active duty soldiers, politicians, reporters, but also neighbors, friends, people whose lives he'd touched in small, quiet ways. The eulogy was given by a retired general who'd served with Kelly in Italy. He said, "Charles Kelly was the kind of man the Army tries to create, but rarely does. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for permission. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right." He paused, then added, "The world needs more Charles Kellys. Men and women who don't wait for someone else to solve the problem, who don't wait for the perfect moment, who just step up and do what needs to be done." Kelly was buried with full military honors at the National Cemetery of the Alleghenies in Pennsylvania. His Medal of Honor was displayed at the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Pittsburgh. But his real legacy isn't in medals or monuments. It's in the example he set. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing it anyway. That leadership isn't about rank or authority. It's about taking responsibility when no one else will. That sometimes the rules need to be bent, not because you don't respect them, but because the situation demands it. And that one person, one determined, stubborn, slightly crazy person, can make a difference. The lessons of Altavilla military historians have studied the Battle of Altavilla for decades. It's taught at West Point, at the Army War College, at officer training schools around the world. Not because it was a large battle, it wasn't. Not because it changed the course of the war, it didn't. But because it illustrates something fundamental about warfare and about life. That initiative matters. That adaptability matters. That sometimes the person who wins isn't the one with the best plan or the most resources, but the one who refuses to quit. Charles Kelly didn't have artillery support, so he borrowed a mortar. He didn't have a full squad, so he went alone. He didn't have perfect training, so he improvised. And in doing so, he held off a battalion. He saved his company. He turned the tide of a battle that could have collapsed the entire beachhead. One man, one decision, one moment of audacity. That's the lesson of Altavilla. That's the legacy of Commando Kelly. In a world that often feels overwhelming, where problems seem too big and we feel too small, Charles Kelly reminds us that one person can make a difference, not by waiting for permission, not by following the script, but by seeing what needs to be done and having the courage to do it. The tactical analysis. Years after the war, military analysts studied Kelly's actions at Altavilla in detail. What they found was remarkable. Kelly's use of the mortar wasn't just brave, it was tactically brilliant. By targeting the German formations at specific points, he disrupted their attack pattern. He forced them to spread out, to take cover, to slow their advance. His decision to go behind enemy lines wasn't reckless, it was calculated. He understood that the Germans were focused on the farmhouse, on the American position. They weren't expecting an attack from behind. By hitting their command post, he decapitated their leadership, threw their attack into chaos. And his use of captured German weapons wasn't just improvisation, it was psychological warfare. The Germans heard their own weapons being used against them. They couldn't tell friend from foe. It added to the confusion, to the sense that they were facing a larger, more organized force. One analyst wrote, "Sergeant Kelly's actions at Altavilla represent a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. He used surprise, mobility, and psychological pressure to defeat a numerically superior force. He turned his weaknesses into strengths and exploited the enemy's assumptions against them." Another noted, "What's remarkable isn't just what Kelly did, but how he did it. He didn't panic. He didn't freeze. He assessed the situation, identified the key vulnerabilities, and acted decisively. That kind of tactical thinking, under that kind of pressure, is extraordinarily rare." The Battle of Altavilla is now used as a case study in military academies around the world. Not just to teach tactics, but to teach leadership, to teach initiative, to teach the importance of thinking independently and acting decisively. Because war, like life, doesn't always give you the perfect situation. Sometimes you have to make do with what you have. Sometimes you have to improvise. Sometimes you have to take risks. And sometimes, if you're brave enough and smart enough and stubborn enough, you can turn an impossible situation into a victory. The mortar that changed everything. Years after the war, a military museum in Italy tried to locate the mortar that Charles Kelly had used at Altavilla. They wanted to put it on display, to preserve it as a piece of history. They never found it. It had been lost or destroyed or simply forgotten in the chaos of war. But in a way, that's fitting. Because the mortar itself wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what Kelly did with it. He took a piece of abandoned equipment, something that had been left behind and forgotten, and turned it into a weapon that saved lives. He didn't have the perfect tool. He didn't have the perfect training. He didn't have the perfect situation. But he had determination. He had courage. He had the willingness to act when everyone else was frozen by fear or protocol or uncertainty. And that made all the difference. There's a quote often attributed to Edmund Burke. "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Charles Kelly did something. When it would have been easier to wait, to follow orders, to let someone else take the risk, he acted. He borrowed a mortar. He walked into enemy fire. He took on a battalion, and he won. Not because he was superhuman, not because he was invincible, but because he refused to accept defeat. That's the real story of Commando Kelly, not the medals or the headlines or the parades, but the moment when a sergeant from Pittsburgh looked at an impossible situation and said, "Well, somebody's got to do something," and then did it. The ripple effect, the impact of Charles Kelly's actions at Altavilla extended far beyond that single day in September 1943. The German battalion that he helped repel was part of a larger counteroffensive designed to push the Allies back into the sea. If Altavilla had fallen, if that high ground had been lost, the entire Salerno beachhead could have collapsed. The invasion of Italy could have failed. The Allied advance up the Italian peninsula could have been delayed by months, maybe years. Thousands of lives could have been lost. The course of the war could have changed, all because one man refused to give up. But the ripple effect went beyond strategy and tactics. It went to the hearts and minds of the men who served with Kelly, who heard about him, who were inspired by him. After Altavilla, soldiers across the Fifth Army started calling themselves Kelly's Commandos. It became a badge of honor, a symbol of initiative, of courage, of the willingness to do whatever it took to get the job done. Officers started encouraging their men to think like Kelly, to adapt, to improvise, to take calculated risks when the situation demanded it. The rigid, by-the-book approach that had characterized much of the early war began to give way to a more flexible, adaptive style of leadership. And it worked. The Italian campaign, brutal and costly as it was, succeeded. The Allies pushed north, took Rome, and eventually forced the Germans to surrender. And while no single person can claim credit for that victory, Charles Kelly's example, his willingness to act when action was needed, played a part. Because leadership isn't just about giving orders, it's about setting an example. And Charles Kelly set an example that echoed through the ranks, through the years, through history. The man behind the medal. It's easy to turn Charles Kelly into a legend, to focus on the dramatic moments, the heroic actions, the Medal of Honor. But the real Charles Kelly was more complicated than that. He was a man who struggled with what he'd done, who had nightmares about the men he'd killed, who wondered if he could have done more, saved more, been better. He was a man who came home to a world that wanted to celebrate him, but he just wanted to forget. He was a man who worked a regular job, raised a family, fixed lawn mowers, and tried to live a normal life while carrying the weight of extraordinary experiences. In many ways, that's the most heroic thing about Charles Kelly. Not what he did in Italy, but what he did after. The way he carried his burden with quiet dignity. The way he refused to let his past define him. The way he kept going, kept working, kept living. Because that's what real courage looks like. Not just the dramatic moments of action, but the daily grind of living with the consequences. Charles Kelly was a hero, but he was also a man. Flawed, complicated, human. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. That heroes aren't perfect. They're not superhuman. They're just people who, in a moment of crisis, find the strength to do what needs to be done. And then, when the crisis is over, they go back to being people. Imperfect, struggling, trying their best. That's Charles Kelly. That's Commando. Kelly. That's the sergeant who borrowed artillery and held off a battalion. Not a myth, not a legend. A man who, when the moment came, stepped up. The question for us, the story of Charles Kelly, raises a question that's as relevant today as it was in 1943. What do we do when we're faced with an impossible situation? When the odds are against us? When the rules don't fit? When no one else is stepping up? Do we wait for permission? Do we follow the script? Do we hope someone else will solve the problem? Or do we do what Charles Kelly did? Do we assess the situation, make a decision, and act? It's not an easy question. Because acting without permission, breaking the rules, going against protocol, these things have consequences. Kelly could have been court-martialed. He could have been killed. His actions could have failed, and he could have been remembered as a reckless fool instead of a hero. But he acted anyway, because he looked at the situation and realized that the risk of doing nothing was greater than the risk of doing something. That's the calculation we all have to make, in our jobs, in our communities, in our lives. When do we follow the rules, and when do we break them? When do we wait for permission, and when do we just act? There's no easy answer, but Charles Kelly's example suggests that sometimes, when lives are on the line, when the stakes are high, when no one else is stepping up, the right thing to do is to act. Not recklessly, not without thought, but decisively, with courage, with the willingness to accept the consequences. Because sometimes, the only thing worse than making the wrong decision is making no decision at all. The final word. On a warm spring day in 1984, less than a year before his death, Charles Kelly was invited to speak at a high school in Pittsburgh. They were having a Veterans Day assembly, and they wanted a Medal of Honor recipient to address the students. Kelly almost said no. He didn't like public speaking. He didn't like being the center of attention. But his wife convinced him. "Those kids need to hear from you," she said. "Not about the war, about life." So he went. He stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of teenagers who had no idea who he was or what he'd done. The principal introduced him, listed his medals, described Altavilla. The students applauded politely, but Kelly could see it in their eyes. They were bored. This was just another old guy talking about ancient history. So Kelly set aside his prepared remarks, and he spoke from the heart. "I'm not going to tell you about the war," he said. "You can read about that in books. I'm going to tell you about a choice." He paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. Every day, you're going to face situations where you have a choice. You can wait for someone else to solve the problem. You can follow the rules even when the rules don't make sense. You can keep your head down and hope things work out. He paused again. Or you can step up. You can take responsibility. You can do what needs to be done, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when no one's asking you to. He looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred. "I'm not special. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who one day saw a problem and decided to do something about it. That's all. And you know what? You can do that too. Every single one of you." He looked back up at the students. The world doesn't need more people waiting for permission. It needs more people willing to act, to step up, to take responsibility. That's what I did. That's what you can do. That's what I hope you will do. He stepped away from the podium. The auditorium was silent for a moment. Then one student started clapping, then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause. Not polite applause, real applause, the kind that comes from being moved, from being challenged, from being inspired. Charles Kelly stood there, uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful that maybe, just maybe, his words had made a difference. Because that's what he'd always wanted. Not to be remembered, not to be celebrated, but to make a difference. One person, one choice, one moment at a time. That was Charles Kelly. That was Commando Kelly. That was the sergeant who borrowed artillery and changed the course of a battle. And that can be you too. When the moment comes, when the situation demands it, when no one else is stepping up, you can be the one who acts. You can be the one who makes a difference. You can be the one who, years later, someone tells a story about. Not because you were perfect, not because you were fearless, but because when it mattered, you stepped up. Just like Charles Kelly did on a hot September day in Italy, when he looked at an abandoned mortar and said, "Well, somebody's got to do something." And then did it. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's the challenge. What will you do when your moment comes?